Good afternoon, everybody. I just wanted to say thank you to ICESA for inviting us to share some information that both of us are really passionate about. And I'm excited to be part of this training for you, for up and coming advocates, or those of us in the room who are just kind of like refreshing what we know. So welcome to your session on the intersection of disability and sexual violence. My name is Sierra Olivia Thomas Williams, and if you feel like using my ancestral language, you can call me Ne'i, which is the pronoun that means that one, or you can use she, her pronouns. I am a person with multiple disabilities and a survivor of polyviolence, so multiple forms of violence across my lifespan that started when I was 3 years old. And I really think that these experiences brought me to this field. And I've been serving the anti-violence field since 1998. Sorry. So I've been in the movement. I'm a movement elder at this point. I've been in the movement about 26 years, and I am the mother of two wonderful young people with disabilities. This is a picture of my daughters and I 2 Mondays ago. I love music. I'm a huge music fan, and I took them to see Shabuzi with me. So that was really fun. And I spent the majority of my career in mainstream organizations. And when we had a huge pivot in what we could do recently, I left the mainstream movement space and started my own organization, which I'll tell you a little bit about. It's called the Nothing Without Us Collective. And I'm just really happy to be here with you. And I will pass the mic.
Hi, all. I am Eliza Brader. I'm a policy analyst, which, if you don't know what that means, it's okay. My parents don't either. And so basically, we do a lot of different things, but like think about the census and how we get all those fun statistics, and people write up reports on like what those statistics mean, in context with sociology and history. That's kind of what I do. So I aim a lot of that work at the disabled and queer communities because I am disabled and queer. I also have autism and pretty severe ADHD. So if you see me like veering off on a track, apologies in advance. I am also an adult survivor of CSA. I am new into advocacy world in terms of that part of my identity. So thank you all for having me. Thank you to Sierra for allowing me, the space to grow in that identity. And I am also the co-director of a new up-and-coming organization. Don't Google us. The website isn't done yet. I have been named co-director of ADA Watch Indiana. So yay! We will be an organization that centers disability voices across the state of Indiana to try to get some real policy change done and to try to bring in different groups like ICESA under kind of an umbrella of a coalition to get some good work and policy work done. Last but certainly not least, I am mom to Lucille Ball. She is my cardiac alert corgi. She is the bestest girl. Here she is pictured with mud all over her face because service dogs are dogs too. And, my work headshot isn't necessarily the best one of me. So
I love it.
Yeah. One last disclaimer before I move on. So you'll notice that I use disabled when I'm talking about people with disabilities. That's just a cultural thing, which we'll talk about later, but it's how I choose to identify myself with my community and my culture. So the still sort of widely recognized way as people with disabilities, but if you notice me saying something different, that's like related to my identity. So, all right.
Okay. And this is about the organization that I started. I am working with the Nothing Without Us Collective, and we are a cross-disability survivor-led training and technical assistance provider. And really, the fundamental thing about the Nothing Without Us Collective is we are working to shift paradigms and practices to be rooted in disability justice and the principles of disability justice. And the primary way that we do this is we uplift and support each other. Like, it's rooted in the leadership of those most impacted by violence. That is really how our work is going to be most effective. And we work with a lot of organizations, health departments, state and local, universities, and communities to really look at and strengthen accessibility and build collective power to do those life-changing things. And we really encourage people to come to our trainings, use our evaluation tools, and build partnerships that support transformational policy and practice changes. And at the end of the presentation, you'll have our contact information, and I know we would love to hear from you.
Yeah. So being autistic and ADHD myself, whenever I'm doing a training like this, I like to set kind of some ground rules, if you will. This is a pro-STEM environment. So that means that if you see me fidgeting or playing with my hair, or if you need to fidget or grab something or, twiddle a pen, you are more than welcome to do so. We encourage that here. That is part of the human experience, and everybody should be as comfortable as possible. We also practice something called Crip Time. So Crip Time, briefly, is a concept that was developed by a disabled activist. And it basically means that disabled brains and bodies move about the world differently. And so sometimes we need more time in order to get where we're going. So if you see me say I need a moment of Crip Time, I'm multiply disabled, so I may take a moment, but we'll keep it brief just so you guys are aware and kind of have the info ahead of time. Next, your mental well-being is my absolute priority in this training. And I know it is for Sierra as well. So I'll discuss on the next slide a couple of the kind of topics we're going to go over. But please, if you need to step away, if you need to take a moment, do so. Burnout is real. Secondary trauma is real. We don't want any of you guys coming away with any kind of harm from this. The last thing I'll say is that you are the expert of your own disability, or I am the expert of my own disability. And that's something we say in the disability community, which means that yes, although there are doctors and, medical professionals and even policy people like me who can tell you about the broader view of a disability, you know what it's like to live in your body. So anything that we're saying about disability should be taken as either a personalized experience or a broad view, but never underestimate or doubt what somebody's telling you about how their disability appears for them. All right, next slide. So our plan for the day. I like to have a plan because otherwise I get distracted. First of all, we're going to talk about, you guys can read this slide, but we're going to talk about people with disabilities and sexual violence prevalence across our lifespans. I'm going to do some defining of disability within the context of sexual violence. We're going to talk about recognizing the violence against people with disability. And I'm going to take you guys on a little bit of a history journey so we can learn about that context. We're going to talk about barriers to services because we all know there are enough barriers and they become tenfold when you're disabled. And then last but not least, we'll do our post training. Now, in between each of those, we want to leave a spot open for questions. This is an accommodation to myself because I will forget what I say. You'll see we'll have a slide. Feel free to put your questions in the chat and we'll just see, as we're going through how much time we have. If we can't get to all the questions, you can always email us. So kind of our content warnings. We're going to talk about statistics around survivors of sexual violence. We're going to talk about the history of state-sanctioned violence against disabled people, especially as it relates to sexual violence. We're going to briefly touch on police brutality. We are going to mention some of the atrocities that happened in Nazi Germany. Anything else I am missing, Sierra? I think I've hit all the high points.
I just think, I really like that you put that there's probably better words of saying this, but the content warning. So I just want to make that sort of a blanket warning across that this is probably going to be overwhelmingly hurtful. The things that we're sharing, it hurts a lot. So just be aware of that as you go through this, and please practice what Eliza talked about, which is taking care of yourself. Legit turn the mic off. Turn the other thing, the sound off if you need to, and just we gave you the slides, so come back to it when you need to. So I appreciate that heads up, Eliza.
Yes, absolutely. All right, pass it off to Sierra.
Yes. Okay. So, what we're going to do today is start off with the big picture, about the sexual violence that happens in the United States, and really what you'll notice about this. So, the numbers are important, but we don't have many of them. And so, I think the thing to recognize throughout this is that people with disabilities experience the most violence in the United States, and yet receive the least amount of restorative and victim services. And so we as a field and as individual practitioners are implicated in that, and really just want to kind of think about that as we go through this. And I should just say this is a ton of numbers, and you have the slides. And so just as somebody with dyscalculia, numbers just don't compute. So if you're like me, don't worry. We've got them if we need them for later. So we talked about the fact that sexual violence is really pervasive. It occurs across the lifespan. And so when we look at ACEs data, US data on adverse childhood experiences, it really illustrates to us that children with disabilities experience up to 3 times more sexual assault than their non-disabled peers. You know, one of the not great things about Indiana is that very rarely in any of our common collectors do we collect disability related data, meaning the demographic. Are you a person with a disability? And often also do not include questions about violence and disability. So that intersection is really, really hard to find. And you will see numbers like 3 times more or 4 times more, and it's because we don't have a lot of the prevalence data that we need. So just kind of looking at Indiana, the Youth Risk Behavior Surveillance survey doesn't collect disability demographics, can't really look at the intersection of disability, sexuality, and sexual violence among Indiana youth. So it's hard to say what is happening every day to the youth in our schools in Indiana. But the YRBSS did look at mental health among students at the intersection of youth and sexuality. And the Indiana Department of Health reported that in 2024, the data showed that nearly 70% of questioning youth and over 60% of lesbian, gay, and bi youth reported that they experience poor mental health most of the time. And so what we can see from both of these pieces of data is that members of communities that are marginalized experience a magnification of vulnerability to abuse and more poor mental health days. And for 65% of LGBTQ plus youth with disabilities, they reported that they experienced disability-based discrimination and significantly higher rates of depression, anxiety, and suicidality. And ultimately, we also do see higher numbers of suicide among youth who identify on the LGBTQ plus spectrum. So what we can see from these numbers is that there are extremely deep health disparities that correlate to disability identity. And so there are ultimately inequitable and unjust preventable differences in safety and well-being for people with disabilities compared to their non-disabled peers. So let's take a look at safety and look at some of the numbers for LGBT youth and adults. So I've said this before, there's actually very little data being collected that includes disability across the nation. This happens. It's not just Indiana, but we do know that people who identify on the LGBTQ plus spectrum experience higher rates of disability. And so we can assume that even though this survey did not ask about disability, we can assume that there is a high number of people with disabilities represented in this data. And so what we find here in a 2023 study is that LGBTQ youth with disabilities faced elevated rates of suicidal thoughts and attempts. And that actually continues into adulthood. And then when we look at the disaggregated data, a 2023 study showed us that gay men are 8 times more likely to experience sexual violence compared to heterosexual peers. And bisexual men and women report the highest incidence of sexual violence among all groups. And then just taking a look at undergraduate women and other women with disabilities. Undergraduate women with disabilities, they experience more sexual violence through force or incapacitation than non-disabled peers. And women with disabilities experience sexual violence at roughly twice the rate of non-disabled women. When you sort of rank the level of disability, if you are a person who has multiple disabilities, the possibility of experiencing sexual violence across the lifespan is like magnified greatly. And then also men with disabilities experience far more sexual violence than their peers without disabilities. And, one of the things that drew me to specialize in violence prevention and intervention regarding disability and like with other people with disabilities is because despite this high prevalence rate of sexual violence that we see across the lifespan, sexual assault reporting rates are very much lower among people with disabilities than non-disabled adults. So if you want to know the percentage, it's 18% of people with disabilities ever report versus 36% of non-disabled adults. And in that same needs assessment by Activating Change, they found that of that small percentage of people with disabilities who did report, only 13% of those got any kind of victim services or restorative services. And which is a travesty. And there are a lot of reasons for that. And we're going to talk a lot about those as we get a little bit further in this presentation. And something that I think is really, really important for you to know as advocates is that the majority of people who are perpetrating harm against people with disabilities are caregivers or family members or peers, somebody who is in the picture all of the time. Activating Change found that 44% of sexual abusers were involved with the person just because they had a disability. And what that is saying really is that it's caregivers who are taking the opportunity to perpetrate sexual violence. And part of the reason why these reporting rates are so low is one, we don't collect data. If you want in this field, if you want funding, you need to prove that you need it through prevalence rates. And when Indiana doesn't collect that data for the youth and the adults, then it makes it harder on us to be legible to funders and potential funders. And so we really, really do need the Department of Health to make different decisions around what questions they include. And another part of it is our complicity. We have difficulty creating inclusive services. And I'm going to actually pass it on to talk through something that is like so key in our field and yet problematic.
So consent, I am sure I do not need to define consent to you all. That is definitely kind of 101 day one, right? However, being a policy analyst, being disabled myself, having, although a low level, but intellectual disability myself, it's important that I bring up what can happen to people with intellectual disabilities. In the state of Indiana, it says, and I like to read laws, they're one of my special interests, so I apologize. I've tried not to put too much of that in. But it says that anyone who, a person cannot consent to sexual activity if they are mentally disabled or deficient. So what does that mean? Well, when we're trying to decide what the law means, typically that happens through courts. And courts do these things called tests. And a test basically says, it's not like, break out your Ticonderoga and your bubble charts. It means that we're going to set a logic, right? And if the case follows this logic, then we apply this verdict or we make this decision about it. And so in the United States at large, the logic that they've decided to apply is that a person with intellectual disability cannot be considered able to consent legally unless they have had appropriate sexual education. Now, what kills me about this is that I was raised in a religious community. I didn't get sex ed until I was 21 years old. So, and, you know, it's a contentious thing right now. We're not teaching it in our schools. And more often than not, a school is even less likely to teach it to disabled people because they don't see them as people. They see them as, you know, numbers or unsexual beings. But the reality is that we are. And so by denying intellectually disabled people sexual education, we're actually denying them of their legal right to engage in consensual sexual activity. Exactly. Somebody put in the comments, forever children. That's what they'd like to think.
Yeah.
All right.
Sorry, Eliza.
You're good. So medical trauma. Am I on the right page?
Yeah, sorry, that was me. My bad.
You're good. Here we go. Okay. Again, crib time, y'all. So medical trauma. This is something that I have personally experienced a lot of. So ensuring that folks understand like what it really is very important to me. Medical trauma is difficult because when we're talking about like traumatic incidences that cause PTSD, we think about it as this one-off event, right? Or it can happen over a timeline, but it has an end date usually. And so with medical trauma, it's not just like a traumatic thing that happens to you in a hospital, but it also becomes living in a body that is traumatic to live in. And so psychologists kind of on the forefront of this field are actually thinking about expanding the definition of PTSD. Because like I said, it's not just a single traumatic experience, and it's not any experience that has a set beginning and end date. So for instance, chronic pain, something that I deal a lot with, or having life-altering complications, right? A lot of people think about the day it happens as traumatic, but they don't realize that living with it every day, the upkeep of these changes and of the pain are in themselves a traumatic thing. And so when you're dealing with survivors, you may be dealing with folks who are actively experiencing the trauma of their disability. Now, that's not for everyone, but it's something that I wanted to put on your radar. And of course, we know that, you know, there are medical reasons, like physical medical reasons that can cause things like psychological breaks, hallucinations. And even if people, you know, come out of those or are able to heal from them, it's still traumatic to be back in a space where you experience those things. So, and I've kind of already touched on this, but it's the psychosocial of it. There's this loss of control, loss of sense of control. Lots of disabled people feel very alienated. We are a very lonely bunch. I don't have the statistics in front of me, but it's something like 5% of disabled people under the age of 30 say that they have few to no friends. So it's just something to consider as you're working with clients, especially if you're going to be encountering them in medical settings. And then the presentation. So I like to always talk about kind of briefly here what it looks like and how often we're seeing this happen. So I mentioned that I have some medical trauma. For me, that it can present as like neglecting or avoiding medical care, right? Because if there is this thing that like is part of your daily experience that is traumatizing, to see it get worse can be hard to admit. There can be, you know, issues with dissociation or not recognizing. And so it becomes a problem. Often, especially when people are in medical settings, especially autistic people like myself, we can be more prone to our meltdowns, our panic attacks, because like I said, being in a medical setting itself becomes traumatic, and it gets compounded every day by living with it. Another thing you might see is people actually using medical facilities more frequently. This is a form of hypervigilance. So if you see folks that, you know, may be labeled as like playing it up or malingering or, you know, all these terrible words we use, that's not necessarily the case. It can actually be a symptom of medical trauma, PTSD. So especially for our children populations, 80% of our children who have had some kind of life-threatening or serious medical illness end up with this kind of medical PTSD. And so when we're working with medically complex children, it's important to remember that they are probably experiencing these types of things, you know, within your interaction. We also don't know how often the medical field actually causes PTSD in adults. Shocker that we wouldn't want to know how bad our medical system is treating people. And what leads to medical PTSD outcomes. But there have been a few like estimate studies, and they're thinking as high as 30 to 50% of people who are in the hospital for any length of stay end up with some form of medical PTSD. All right, quick stop for any questions.
I have a question, Eliza. My name is Hannah. I am curious, and I haven't had a chance to look through all of the resources that you all sent earlier, but will you be providing any sort of insight about how to support clients that have medical trauma if you're not in a medical setting?
Yes, that is within the resources list. And I can also ensure that I can work with ICESA and maybe ensure that I have a more robust resource, like a packet.
That would be awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Happy to.
And Eliza's contact information is in this as well. And I would encourage you to connect.
Yeah,
I
feel
saw
free-
Shannon came off. Oh, sorry, Eliza.
You're good.
No, you're fine. I was going to ask for that packet as well, more on a personal note. My partner is disabled and has some medical trauma, so I was hoping to get some resources for them.
Yeah, absolutely. I can make sure that I grab that packet. I have it saved to my computer. I wasn't sure. We never know how, we don't want to inundate you with stuff. So
Thank you.
yeah, happy to.
All righty. I'll have us go. Why don't you tell us about what we mean when we say disability?
Yeah, so we're kind of jumping around a little bit here because everything is so like interconnected. But I did want to take the time to really deeply define disability. So first of all, some statistics, because that's just my training. 10% is like the rough average of how many people in Indiana we believe have a disability. But something interesting that has come out of an analysis of the most recent census is that it varies wildly based on where you live, how likely you are to have a disability. So in our metropolitan areas, low as 7%, but our rural areas get as high as 20%. Which is just, I think, 7 points higher than the national average. Now, a little tiny policy aside, based on the recent federal bill, there are 12 rural hospitals in Indiana that are suspecting that they will have to close their doors because of the federal budget cuts. Now, I don't need to tell you that when you have a higher rate of disabled people and now you are closing off those hospitals, we are looking at higher rates of assault. Like the science tells us, you are more likely to be assaulted if you don't have access to good medical care, higher rates of violence, and of course, just higher rates of people being sick. So a little policy aside there. Back to defining disability. On to the next slide. So again, I love my legal words. Disability, right? Physical or mental impairment substantially limits one or more major life activities. The interesting part that people usually forget is having a record of such impairment or being regarded as having such impairment. So if you have someone who has a record of being impaired, that you know in the past that they've had this disability, even if they don't have it now, they're still afforded certain protections under the law. Or if it's like, I don't want to say the town rumor, but if they're known in like a workplace, for instance, or a school setting as being disabled, legally, you are supposed to treat that person as if they are disabled. Some surprising things that also count as disabilities: infertility, and I kind of touched on this, but any kind of temporary disability, so something that comes and goes or something that you have briefly, means that you were disabled for a time and you're protected during that. Moving right along. So there are actually, and some folks may know this, I know a couple disabled and neurodivergent folks have already jumped in the comments, which I appreciate, but there are actually multiple models of disability. And by model, I mean how we conceptualize disability and view it as a culture. You're good. And so the model that we most often operate under in modern day society, the world around, is the biomedical model. And this model basically assumes that disability is something to fix. It sees disability as only an illness. And, we'll talk a little bit more about this, but the biomedical model of disability as something to fix has roots within the eugenics movement, and the eugenics movement led us to deem disabled people unfit and then defective. And then when we decided, we'll at least give them charity, we started calling folks handicapped. Now, the word itself, handicapped, is an old word, but at the time of its inception for disabled people, it was used for racehorses who were too fast, and so they had been bogged down in order to make the race more fair. And so the idea was, well, you have a limitation, right? Using that same kind of model, that same kind of ideology, the social model. So the social model is what we use most in settings like this, settings where we are more socially conscious, settings where we're willing to accommodate and work with disability. And it is slowly becoming the pervasive model in everywhere, it seems, except the medical community. But that's, a whole nother bag of beans. So the social model believes that disability exists between the person and society. So basically, you don't have anything wrong with you, right? But like, you're just kept out of society. Your disability is what society doesn't allow you to do. And so by fixing society, we can fix your disability. This originated in 1950, popularized in 1990 by feminist scholars. Like I said, this is the predominant model. This is what almost everybody uses. I continue to be difficult, as I noted with my language earlier. This is not the model that I use. Disabled people, as we have created something called disability studies, have started to think about what model we would want for ourselves. And there are dozens of models that have come out of this. And, we're still deciding what it looks like for each person and kind of what the community as a whole likes. But for me, I prefer the cultural model. I don't believe that my disability is caused by anybody, or, it's not by society. It's not by the medical, establishment. It's not something that needs fixed. I see it as a natural difference of myself. It is what it is, sort of. It's a medical thing too, of course. But in terms of how I go about society, to me, the important part of my disability is that I am part of a culture. We have our own alphabet within Braille. We have our own language within sign language. We have our own understandings of art and our own music and our own television. And so seeing us as a culture, I think, to me, reinforces to the world at large that we are a community that stands together and kind of needs to be brought together, and that we aren't necessarily all these separate things. I hope that makes sense, giving you sort of the quick version. Somebody else mentioned in the comments that they're neurodiverse, but I do want to talk about neurodiversity briefly. Neurodiversity kind of falls within the social/cultural model. It believes that brains work differently and we are as we are. Right? There's not a right way to think necessarily, but there are different ways that people navigate the world around them based on the way their brain is built. So the big one that's missing from this big, lovely wheel is trauma. We know that trauma impacts the way people think and view the world, and it can actually impact the biology of your brain. Now, I saw that you guys already had a neuroscientist, I think, on here earlier, potentially, so I'm going to try not to butcher this. But basically, children who encounter PTSD, who end up with PTSD, end up not having their synapses pruned. So synapses are the connection information highways in our brain. And as we get older, they naturally trim off, right? Because we need less of those, because we're not learning, right? We're not learning how to be like a human being. And so, but we're finding in children with PTSD, those pathways don't get pruned. And so we grow up, children with PTSD like myself, grow up into adults that have these hyper connections in our brain. And scientists are starting to sort of posit that maybe this connects into the way that PTSD functions, right? Because the brain is always hyper vigilant because it's got more places to send information to and from. Also, fun aside, neural pruning also doesn't happen in children with ADHD and autism, and we don't know why. So, but, scientists are starting to work on trying to figure out why we see these differences in these, in children that have dealt with these different disorders or neurodiversities. All right, that is it for that. That was a quick one. Any questions for me?
Feel free to either unmute or add any questions in the chat.
Hannah, EMDR changed my life too, completely. I always thought it was so weird. For y'all who don't know what EMDR, it's eye movement desensitization.
Reprocessing.
Yeah. And I always felt weird doing it because you move your eyes, but nothing else. And thank you for sharing that, Hannah. It's so good.
And this is not so much a question, more of just gratitude for what you're doing and the people that you are helping. And with many service providers also being survivors and victims themselves, this is just huge. And honestly, the longer I do this job, the more I understand myself, which in doing so allows me to understand others even more. And I just really fucking appreciate it.
I love it. Thank you.
Yeah, I have ADHD. I've had it since I was a kid. And to see like there's a reason like some of us get targeted more. Like I've had experiences at 6, 14, and as an adult, and I just seeing that there's like this correlation that it's not just I put myself in situations, is that, you know, people target us the way we are is really affirming. Sorry, I don't know why I'm about to cry, but just thank you for this.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
glad you're willing to be vulnerable with us. That's huge. And I'm just so appreciative.
Yeah. Thank you all for sharing. This is why I do this, because I like to hear from other folks. And yeah, I want other people to understand themselves and the laws and policies around them better so that we
Mhm.
can build a better world.
And so we're about to get into some more specifics about violence itself, who is committing it. And so that's the next section, is about sexual violence against people with disabilities. And so this will be difficult, however, I think fundamental, of course, to advocacy. And so what I want to start with is our good old power and control wheels. And I'm going to send some through so you can take a look at those. Visually a list. For me, I really appreciate like the visual of the power and control wheel. And so I have given you 2 versions of this. One for intimate partners and the other for caregivers, because we learned earlier that the majority of people who are perpetrating sexual violence against people with disabilities are caregivers or companions. And so really having that information is really necessary, and understanding what the differences are in terms of how sexual violence is committed against people with disabilities, and some of the things that go along with that vulnerability of being disabled. And so what we've learned earlier, that people with disabilities experience a massive magnification of rates of sexual violence over their non-disabled peers. And Eliza talked us through the models of disability and how social structures do create barriers for people with disabilities. And these social and structural barriers exponentially increase the risk of likelihood for sexual violence. And this is just a small list of some of the things that are in that power and control wheel. And these things include isolation, lack of employment, which also includes low pay, which is legislated. So businesses are allowed to apply for what is called sub-minimum wages to pay people with disabilities for using crip time in their work, essentially. There's also a lack of opportunity in terms of employment. Many employers feel like they don't want to hire people with visible disabilities or people who they might consider less capable of doing the job. However, there's a lot of research and science that says actually disabled people are more loyal, dedicated, on time, like just better workers overall. And one of the things, yes, sorry, Shannon, I just got distracted. Places like Goodwill will take advantage of the disability community and paying them so little. Absolutely. And then like the school that they say they offer is only getting the GED, which I when I say that, I heard myself, and that was like super ableist. What I meant to say is they say that it seems like college, but it anyways, I'm complaining now. That guy who owns Goodwill is a freaking billionaire. Anyways, okay, that was my personal comment on that, by the way. And one of the other things around employment is that people with disabilities are prohibited from building wealth in America. If you receive Social Security benefits or medical benefits, you cannot have assets, or you can have very few assets. And if you do have assets, it needs to be controlled by the state. Like you have to, if you have a large savings, you have to put it into a specific account that you can only spend it on certain things, and that it is sort of kept by the state, kind of like how the federal government has Indian territory. Sorry, I'm speaking from my perspective as a Miwok person. The land is in guardianship by the state. Anyways, okay, so people with disabilities experience poverty, which is also related to isolation, lack of transportation, housing. We're going to talk about mandatory reporting in this state. In most states, we do have mandatory reporting, and that can actually destroy a person with disabilities' life and incarcerate them for life in a nursing home or a prison. And another thing that increases risk for sexual violence against people with disabilities and relates back to that isolation is no internet access. And I'll add no access to like smartphones or computers or things like this. And so all of these things increase the opportunity for people who do perpetrate sexual violence to actually like have access to people with disabilities. And one of the things that I want to really bring your attention to, because it is so related to what we can do in terms of housing. Like we understand how important housing is for the safety of survivors. But in the United States, less than 1% of the housing stock that is available is mobility device accessible. So meaning the 99.9% of the housing stock in the United States is inaccessible for people who use mobility devices, especially things with wheels on the bottom, like power chairs or wheelchairs. And so what this means is if a survivor cannot stay in your shelter because your shelter is not accessible, what happens? And so this is where community relationships with hotels and motels becomes like so important and can be life-changing, but we know that that is really temporary. So what this does is it leaves people with disabilities stuck in place. And in fact, a lot of survivors with disabilities choose not to report or get medical treatment because that increases the likelihood of mandatory reporting, which causes harm and it can lead to institutionalization. And so that in itself is a risk for sexual violence. And it's part of that magnification effect that people with disabilities experience that I talked about. And so this is the slide where I wanted to talk about the power and control wheel. And it's really important and helpful for advocates to understand the unique ways that people with disabilities are targeted with abuse and by who. And so I've talked a little bit about this before, but the people who target people with disabilities are the communities who have the most access. And this is caregivers, peers, family, and intimate partner. And like much like we know for like the field in general, that stranger rape happens less often. And that is also true for people with disabilities, but it does happen. And I just want to point out that there's some slippage there between who is a stranger and who's a caregiver, because often the caregivers who come into people's home, the staff are strangers. And so there's like this implication of intimacy that is forced, and it doesn't really exist. And so I thought that was an important distinction. So while the traditional power and control dynamics center on intimidation and isolation, coercion, abuse against people with disabilities also includes control over access to care and care communication, autonomy, and things that are just patently essential for daily survival, essential for daily survival. So some of these unique forms of power and control include, yes, abuse of benefits, withholding or misusing supports. So like not allowing somebody to have their mobility device or communication aid or medications. And they do that in order to gain compliance. In other words, if you are not going to do this thing that I want you to do, I'm going to make it impossible for you to do anything else. Another thing is exploiting caregiver privilege. And somebody in the comments said forever children. So this is just one of those ways of perpetrating ableism and exploiting caregiver privilege by treating an adult as a child, by making decisions without consent, which includes mandatory reporting or denying privacy. This happens a lot in group homes. Economic exploitation, like you said, Same or Simi. I'm not sure how to pronounce your name, but I'd love for you to tell
That's
me.
the first way. It's Same.
Same. Thank you. Absolutely. Abusive benefits is an example of economic exploitation or controlling and keeping those benefits. Using someone's funds for staff or family gain. I had a friend whose van was stolen by a staff member. Isolation and gatekeeping can happen, limiting access to friends and access to advocates when things happen or information. And then in terms of minimizing and blaming, this can look like people saying things like, that person is just seeking attention, or I was a little harsh on the person who I served today because I'm so stressed out and they needed so much, things like that. And so it ends up being really, really, really hard. Shannon, go ahead.
So I've worked in a little bit of all mental health, and there was a point where I worked for a company that dealt with adults with cognitive disabilities, and they made like houses, and they tried to, in theory, give them the most normal life, is how they put it. But I remember seeing like rampant abuse of the clients, including like verbal beratement of a client of ours who had Down syndrome and talking to me about her in ways that were so demeaning. And I looked over at her and she understood everything that was being said about her.
Yeah.
But nobody would believe her because of her disability.
Yeah.
So painful.
Forever children, incapable. This results in a lack of prosecution. People who are considered unable to understand what's happening are called bad witnesses. And so prosecutors are not willing to lose cases. So they just don't even bring cases forward. I have friends who were told that. So I had a friend who experienced rape, and she was told by the law enforcement officer, because the person who raped her, the law enforcement guy said, like, he's too disabled to understand what he did to you. And I just thought, where did you get, who told you that? That was personally his perspective of what happened. And so this is why we have such low rates of people with disabilities getting the treatment or the services that we need. It's awful. Yeah, like Simi says, like, they can't possibly understand, like they can't possibly understand the complexity of the world, and they probably understand things better. Yeah, I agree. Like more, like deeply understand. And so, yeah, one of those, and we can participate in this. And in fact, we are expected to. And so there are so many ways that we as advocates, and if there's any prevention is in the room, we can perpetrate harm against people with disabilities. And so I do want to say that mandatory reporting laws are, they're meant to protect. And I understand that. And they probably can, and they probably do. But more often than not, the way the system is set up is not one in which that actually helps after these reports are made. So for adults with disabilities, mandatory reporting can cause some serious harm. So when every disclosure automatically triggers a report to Adult Protective Services or law enforcement, survivors lose control of their own story and their choices. And the very control of that abuse has already been taken away. And so we really need to have procedures in place where we acknowledge this and try to work through it. And so for many disabled survivors, being reported can lead to a loss of autonomy or housing, especially if authorities decide that they cannot live safely on their own. Institutionalization or guardianship can place people with disabilities back under restrictive or even abusive conditions. And retaliation or loss of essential supports, if the person reported as the abuser is also their caregiver or staff member or family provider, and people are really at risk for retaliation in those cases. And what this ends up doing is increasing fear and silence, because survivors learn that seeking help can mean losing safety, losing privacy, losing your home, losing your independence. And so as advocates, our role is to navigate these laws with transparency and ethically, and to explain reporting requirements in plain language. And so I think on my next slide, okay, so not on my next slide. I am going to take you through a recommended process that you may already be using around mandatory reporting, but did want to share a little bit about human trafficking, which does often have a sexual element. So people with disabilities are at increased risk for human trafficking because traffickers exploit the same systems that create the dependence and isolation that we talked about, that care and the housing benefits and access to medical services. So someone might be targeted not despite the disability, but because of it. And so traffickers can pose as caregivers or romantic partners or service providers, and they use this access and control over essential things like housing or medication or income to keep the person trapped. And in some cases, legitimate services, sites of legitimate services like group homes or home health programs can become sites of exploitation when oversight is weak. And oversight is weak. There is no place for people to report their service providers, so that, like, a central reporting place, so that me as a parent can know the person who I am having come into my home is actually safe. Like, those things are not in place. People will be fired and move on to the next caregiving organization. So some of the things that are different for disabled survivors is that traffickers might use medical neglect or broken equipment or withhold medications as punishment and control, or often over medicate someone to easily control them. They might control benefits or be representative payees, taking a survivor's Social Security income or Social Security disability income. Often trafficking survivors have limited communication, and this is also true for people with disabilities who already don't have access to these things. So restricted phone use, restricting social media, or restricting interpreter access. And we talked about this already, but survivors are often labeled as not credible witnesses or non-compliant clients. And what that does when people make reports, if this person is labeled as non-compliant, the people who receive the report see this and sort of disregard what's happening. They have behavioral issues, they're seeking attention. And so when those kinds of claims are made, the next person who reads the file is just like discounts the person already. And so some of the red flags that we want to look out for are very similar to trafficking survivors without disabilities. This is when someone else speaks for the person or controls their schedule or their documents, when a person expresses fear of getting someone in trouble or being moved. The survivor might seem coached or overly deferential to a caregiver or an employer. You might see unexplained fear or anxiety around certain people. There are some environmental or financial signs. Saime talked about representative payee. They manage the finances for people. And if we are seeing one person managing the finances for multiple unrelated adults, and this is not a caregiver organization, that's a red flag. There are other things like working long hours with no pay. And I might just recall that subminimum wage is a thing. And so it makes me kind of think, like, is this labor trafficking at a mass scale when I think about that? Just some of the other things, the person may not have control of their phone, mobile devices, and things like this. So trafficking, yes, slave wages. Trafficking may not look like stranger kidnapping. It can look like coerced care or exploited dependence. And so the best response starts with believing people, believing the survivor, restoring control, connecting them with people who are culturally competent in both disability and trafficking and disability centered advocacy resources. And I'm going to pass it to Eliza.
Yay, more fun topics, everybody. So as I mentioned earlier, I'm a policy analyst, which means that I like to look at everything when we're talking about trying to fix a problem. As lots of you have noted, our system is so imperfect and so flawed that we have only started actually having people like me to look at the real impact of laws and policies in like the last 20 years. So this is still a new field we've not considered really before at any scale, like what the impacts are. So nevertheless, when I'm doing these types of trainings, I think it's important for me as a disabled person and for you as advocates to know the history of state-sanctioned violence in this state. So we're going to go through that. Yeah, go ahead and go to the next slide. So originally conceived of by able-bodied white men to help the disabled populations, our first one in the United States actually started in 1773, which for those of you who are bad at history like me still may know, that is before we were even a nation. We were putting disabled people in cages. We were shackling them to walls, denying them food and bathing them in ice water as a way to calm the mental anguish. So, and you know, credit where it's due, some doctors, some institutions tried to improve along the way. But the fact of the matter is that containing disabled people in this way was not only legal, but it was the right way to do things for 200 years in our nation. In 1972, a brave man named Geraldo Rivera, who was a documentarian, back into one of these state-run facilities known as Willowbrook. This is a photo here on the slide from Willowbrook. These are young men sleeping in their own filth in chairs because they had no beds provided to them. Also at Willowbrook, they later found evidence that they, and I believe Sierra has more info on this on another slide, but they also were medically testing on these disabled people. And that's what we did. A lot of our medical testing that we have today is because until about the 1980s, we were testing medicines on disabled people without their consent. The first rights for institutionalized people with disabilities to even have access to food and clothing and care was not until 1980, and disabled people did not have a right to live in our community until 1999. Now, I know I'm young, but that is still within my lifetime that disabled people were not able to even be allowed to live in our homes and our communities. More fun. So connecting this back to the history of sexual violence, forced sterilization. Now, the state of Indiana was actually the pioneer in forced sterilization of disabled people. We put the first laws on the books ever, 1907. 1927, a woman tried to avoid being sterilized in the state of Virginia, and the Supreme Court not only affirmed that she should be sterilized at the state's request, but that because her mother and grandmother had been promiscuous, that it was a sign that there was a genetic component. This young woman's name was Carrie Buck, and Miss Carrie Buck, historians have since found out that she was actually a child sexual assault survivor. It had pervaded in her family for generations, and the women were made the guilty party and were institutionalized once they were no longer deemed useful to their families. So now, again, a little history lesson here. So Indiana did it first. Virginia decided it was legal nationally. And then in 1933, when Nazi doctors were deciding their eugenics laws and looking for inspiration, they decided to use almost word for word the Indiana state statute on sterilization. They heralded it. There's documentation showing that Nazi doctors heralded Indiana's sterilization laws as like a policy champion, gonna save the world, and was going to create a more civil society. Now, within the time that the Nazis reigned, about 12 years, Nazis sterilized 400,000 disabled people. Unfortunately, we kept sterilizing disabled people in the United States without their consent until 1983. And that was the last time that a state could decide that a disabled person was sterilized. So between the two, Nazis sterilized 400,000 people, but we in the United States sterilized 700,000 disabled people over that time period. Longer time period, but we still managed to do more harm.
And can I just add a quick little thing? Not so often people of color were put into that category. So, for
Mhm.
example, in my history, there are Indigenous women who are my ancestors who were sterilized without their consent because they were considered imbeciles. And that is actually how United States took our land, is they made us disabled children. And so this is also deeply connected to racism.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you for pointing that out. I had it in my notes and I didn't hit on it. But yeah, disability at this time was not, it could be that you were gay or were a woman that liked wearing pants. Like any reason that you were different could be considered a disability during this time. The last thing I want to point out with this is that as of this year, a caretaker can still decide that their adult child who has some rights can be sterilized against their will. That is still legal in the United States. It still goes on. The most recent case on it was decided in 2022 and decided that that should be able to continue nationally. I'll leave it at that. Back one, please. Right? Nope. Here we are. My bad.
Okay.
So so much anger, right? I have already pissed you off. I am sure I don't want to go super deep on police brutality, not because it isn't incredibly important, but because I feel like I can only ethically fit so much sorrow into one PowerPoint presentation. So
we do have 15 minutes left.
Okay.
I could talk forever doing a quick time check.
So you guys can read this. Basically, ugly laws, that's the one thing I really want to touch on here, is that ugly laws were something that kept disabled people from being out in public. Last one was repealed in 1970 in Chicago. So you could be institutionalized for being disabled. I also want to point out that autistic people, we most often report fear of police based on autistic police brutality as the number one reason we don't report our sexual assaults. So I will leave you with that so that Sierra can get on with it.
Well, let's pause here for a moment.
Does anybody have any questions?
Get a little afraid of my feelings sometimes. I'm like, I want to prevent violence, not cause it. Dang it. But I do want to do violence, which it's not good. Just like a little confession here. Okay, let's get into some barriers for survivors with disabilities. And we're going to start with oppression and the roots of sexual violence. There are an oppression. And we've talked a lot about the impact of oppression on people with disabilities without quite naming it that, but we did not yet specifically name ableism as a root cause. And what ableism is prejudice and discrimination against people with disabilities in preference for, quote, normative, non-disabled bodies and ways of moving and ways of communicating. And ableism it can be implicit, it can be explicit, it can be super obvious or hidden, and it happens at scale. We learned that people with disabilities as individuals are at higher risk for sexual violence just by living, just by being in their homes, just by being with companions and caregivers. And Eliza took us through some examples of that state-sanctioned violence against youth and adults and the impact of Indiana state legislation on genocide globally. So ableism manifests itself both on the individual level and the global level. And something that I just want to say about sexual violence and kind of what we know about sexual STIs, sexually transmitted infections. What we know about these things comes directly from state-sanctioned sexual violence. So just kind of thinking about the Willowbrook children, parents were encouraged to give their children to Willowbrook. And Willowbrook, the doctors there infected children with hepatitis. And that is why we know what happens to the human body when they get hepatitis. And this is very similar to the Tuskegee experiments and how we know all about syphilis and what it does to the body. And something that people don't often talk about, the reason why we have birth control in this country, effective pill, is because of experimentation on Black and brown bodies, specifically on the women in Puerto Rico. And so that is how so many women died. So many women were sterilized because of taking that drug, so that women in America, white women in America, could have access to birth control for the first time. So ableism is just, it's rampant. And some of the ways that this can look is coming through this assumption of incompetence by law enforcement. Our legal definition of consent, which Eliza covered, it assumes incompetence and incapacitation. It prevents people from experiencing the full range of human living. So this ableist paradigm also informs the behavior of medical staff and advocates, companions, partners, caregivers. Mandatory reporting is closely tied to this assumption of incompetence. And, you know, I talked about how law enforcement may choose not to pursue a case because of the different ways that people with disabilities communicate or experience time or even experience trauma. And what this does is it locates the barrier on the survivor with disabilities, not on the ableist systems that are supposed to prevent survivors get access to justice. But ableism can also appear in the physical world, like failing to incorporate accessibility into building designs, buildings without automatic doors or braille on signs, websites, printed materials. And also, let's talk about touch for a moment. Imagine if I just sat down next to you and decided to kick back and put my feet on your legs as if you were a stool of some sort. People do that. They rest their arms and legs on other people's mobility devices as if it is a piece of furniture. And something we need to realize is that these are extensions of someone's body. You would never, I would hope you would never actually do that to a human being. People do that all the time. One of the biggest perpetrators, or I should say, one of the biggest offenders of this is airport staff or people in hospitals who think they're just helping. Let me just wheel you away without your consent. So it goes back to that forever children thing too. So let's keep these in mind as we continue to explore organizational barriers. So I'm just saying this out loud for myself. We don't have very much time left, so I'm going to go a little bit faster through this than I usually would. So with accessibility, we are not just talking about the physical, about ramps and doorways. We are talking about how survivors with disabilities enter and receive our services and believe and are able to make choices and stay safe within our systems. And so some of the barriers, many of the barriers that I've noticed over my 26 years of service can be sort of put into these three categories of lack of access, the denial of humanity, and a lack of choice. So when I say lack of access, I am talking about the physical spaces, but also if the organization has absolutely no cultural relativity training, that may be a barrier to people receiving services. Often shelters and rape crisis centers are not like pet relief, or not pet, I'm so sorry, that is not what I meant. Service animal relief areas are often down the road, or maybe it's only concrete, and there can be also sensory things like harsh lighting or loud noises. Transportation is often limited or non-existent. Often survivors who do want to come to rape crisis centers or shelters just can't, because there is a severe lack of accessible transportation in Indiana. To my knowledge, are few to no accessible Ubers and Lyfts and things like that, which would be ideal, but not available. Denying humanity, we talked a lot about this already. Being considered unreliable witnesses or assuming incompetence or touching people, dismissing trauma responses as behavioral issues. And all of these things are rooted in ableism. And what they do is they send the message to disabled people that their pain, their choices, and their stories matter less. And this is also connected to lack of choice. Disabled survivors face systems that limit their autonomy. Let's see, we talked through a lot of this, so I'm going to move on. And this framework, I would really recommend that you come back to later and just kind of sit down with it and think about it, because this is one of my favorite ways to complicate this idea of accessibility. This is a humanitarian framework developed specifically for gender-based violence in humanitarian situations. And what this does is it centers survivors in the building of services that are needed. And so they ask 4 questions, and this is around availability, accessibility, acceptability, and quality. And so let's start with the fundamental question of availability. Are services available to everyone who needs them? And that means not only geographically or physically, but culturally. And next, when we get to the question of accessibility, you can see that this is not just a physical thing. It's multifaceted and connected to the determinants of health that really create wellness for people. So just thinking through financial accessibility, bureaucratic and administrative accessibility, social accessibility, information and technology. And one of the things that I want to mention about bureaucratic accessibility and victim services is asking ourselves, how much do we understand about the complications of legal consent for people with disabilities, or how guardianship laws can impact access to services and prevention, or whether people with disabilities can get access to affordable, accessible housing, or even access to our Indiana shelters. In terms of quality, this is talking about, are there skilled professionals and effective, equitable services and resources in your community? And this idea of acceptability, this is determined by the perspective of the people most impacted by this. In terms of acceptability, are your services respectful, safe, culturally relevant? Are they non-discriminatory? Do they show respect and responsiveness? And so what we can do by looking at this framework is move beyond, is this building accessible, to, does the survivor have meaningful, dignified access to care and choice and safety? So what this can do is really transform the barriers from the last slide into concrete areas for change. And I actually, so we do have quite a few recommendations for advocates, but because I'm so pressed for time, I actually want to take you through this one. There is a handout that I put into the chat that you'll receive by mail. It's called Companion Intake Forms, and Companion Intake Forms is going to have this navigating mandatory reporting process on it. And so what you want to do is have a process in place, because you are legally required to report a vulnerable adult. If you believe that they are unsafe, we need to have processes in place to ensure that their safety continues beyond their interactions with you. And so what we need to do is make sure that this process is transparent and collaborative and centered on the survivor's consent as much as possible. And so I think a lot of you probably have something similar in place for when you are advocating with youth. And so you're going to be thinking about how you translate that process. So you want to give choices wherever possible. And you want to give the heads up that you're required to report certain things, and that before they speak to you, you want them to know that. And you can give them the choice. You can choose to share with us or not. And you might want to check in multiple times throughout this process and ask, do you understand this? Do we need more information? Not because you're doubting the understanding, but because we're talking about a traumatic moment where the brain is just not, like, you're not in your frontal lobe. And so you want to make sure that the survivors know. And I want to say that the follow-up to this is so, so, so important. You all are already thinking about and doing safety plans. And so what I want you to think about is your safety plan needs to address what happens if the person is removed from their homes. So how do they stay safe in a nursing home? Because a nursing home greatly increases the risk for sexual violence. And another fundamental question is, how is the survivor going to get out of the nursing home? What is that going to look like? I have had a very close friend who was stuck for 18 months just because she sought medical treatment for a fall. And the doctor said, you're not independent enough to live on your own. And she was stuck. And so I need you to know that your safety plan needs to include things like this. And so I am going to actually move over to Eliza. We only have a few minutes to talk through, to bring their attention to some resources.
I'm going to suggest something here. I'm going to talk through my taking care of yourselves slide part 2. And then I say we answer some questions if we have time. Cool?
Okay.
All right.
Yes.
So taking care of yourself part 2. 58% of people with disabilities who qualify for accommodations in the workplace do not request accommodations. A lot of that is because what somebody pointed out is because people are, we call it stigma, but what is stigma really in this case? Well, it's a fear of being seen as othered. It's also a fear of, I'm not that bad yet, right? We have this fear of disability that's like ingrained in us with ableism, probably because of all of the history of violence. And so I am going to encourage you, if you think you might benefit from disability accommodations, please try to go through that process. If for no other reason, then you might have a coworker like me someday who has multiple severe disabilities and really needs someone who knows how to go through it. Take care of yourselves. Take care of your disabilities, even if you don't see yourself as disabled. If you think it can help you, it probably can. And the more places and people that report being disabled, the more funding comes in for accommodations. So, all right, I'll get off that soapbox. Are there any resources you want to touch on, Sierra, specifically?
I think that people can look through these. I would highly recommend going to the Disability Justice and Violence Prevention Resource Hub. Oh, okay, I was looking for this slide. Gosh darn it, there we go. In case you want to reach out to us, I know both of us love what we're doing and would be delighted if you reached out to us. And yeah, go ahead.
Any questions? Do we have a second?
We have 1 second.
Feel free to go over a little bit on time in case we do have any additional questions.
Okay.
Anyone that needs to go, feel free to go, but we will keep
thank you all for
recording.
being a wonderful crowd. I've done these
Yes.
things before, but it's been a while and I've not ever had such a wonderful crowd. So thank you.
One of the things that I want to bring your attention to is that it's the TISM. That's my favorite. It's really important for you to become collaborative partners with the disability serving organizations in your community, because there is especially if it's a residential or day program, so much sexual violence happens during the day that is underreported, not reported. People who work and live there are not going to come to you. You have to go to them. And there are so many reasons for that. And so one thing that I wanted to point out to you is that there's an organization that partnered with me when I was working with Indiana Coalition Against Domestic Violence. And over 8 years, they developed the capacity to provide advocacy to people with disabilities. So if you are curious and don't know where to start with your sort of like cultural relativity training, I would suggest that you get in touch with Accessibility. Susan Ferguson, who used to be an executive director of a dual program in Indiana for a lot of years, is now the co-executive director at Accessibility, and she is a huge resource to us here in Indiana. And so you have contact information for them. And one of the members of the Nothing Without Us collective, their name is Kat Chappelle, and they work at the Arc of Indiana. Genius human being who knows all the things, a researcher, human sexuality and disability educator. And then in terms of legal advice, Indiana Disability Rights is going to be the place that you call up to ask questions and partner around that. Let's see. Eliza, can you think of any one of these resources that you wanted to highlight specifically? Maybe learning from other disabled people.
So yeah, the supporting people with IDD who do want to be sexual. There's a webinar coming up that is totally free for anybody who's just interested in that. It is a resource I stole from a page Sierra made a few years back, actually.
Which one? Where should I go? This one?
Yep.
Elevate Us? Okay.
So does anybody have any questions? I saw one or two people were going to stay late.
Yeah. Well, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I think mine was more of like and Shannon and I had kind of been talking about it, like the little thread there under my question about like, I have to believe that, there are good people, because I know that there are, right? But it's like, I feel like some people purposefully remain ignorant about things so that they don't have to come to terms with the reality of things. And it's not that they don't feel bad for the people, or like, I don't know, kind of confusing. But when we were talking about like, the humanity that's removed and taken from people, like, I guess there's a part of me that feels like it also at some point has to come as some kind of self-preservation for others.
Sorry, I don't mean to cut you off.
Oh, no, you're fine. It's just, I don't really know. I can't really make the question. I can't really like articulate it, but that's my thought.
I know exactly where you're getting around to, and it brings up this idea of in disability studies, they've come up with this concept called temporarily able-bodied. And basically what it refers to is the fact that by the legal statute we talked about today, we are all born, and if we live a long and happy life, we will die disabled. Ability is an ephemeral thing in the middle that people try to cling to. But the fact of the matter is, it's not the natural human condition. So I think that it's a lot of greed and the desire to have people make as much money as possible for certain people is a lot of why we have the idea of ability that we have today.
I love that perspective. Like, people with disabilities are the largest minoritized communities across the globe.
Shannon,
imagine if we could just get together.
I'm working on it. Shannon, were you going to say something?
I just want to thank you. My headphones died, and I'm kind of glad they did, because my partner's been sitting on the bed and they got to listen to all of this, which is why I had so many snippets about them in the comment in the chat, because they would make the comment. I'm like, that would be really, really good for people to know. So I could see some of their face when they heard things that made sense to them and they got to feel seen was amazing. So I just love that you guys have this whole training, and it's so important, because I have seen where people who are disabled get horribly treated, and I have fought against it before. So I'm just really thankful that we had this today. This is how we wrapped up our day.
I love that. Our website is nothing-without-us.org, and that website is going to have the entire body of the work that I have done over the last 18 years to really move forward these ideas around disability survivor-centered services and prevention. And we have like 40 webinars on there. We have evaluation tools. You can get a hold of us on that website. And so I know I'd love to get together. So, and thank you for letting us linger.
Yeah.
I appreciate that so much.
Shannon, I appreciated your interjections from your partner so much. Please let them know that it's always good to not be the only disabled, loud person in the room, even if you kind of are.
Well, thank you to both Sierra, Olivia, and to Eliza. I think that's most of our questions. And if we have any others, we'll be sure to follow up with you. Overall, this concludes our training for today, and we will start back up with training at 9 a.m. tomorrow morning with Angie Morris, with Whitney Cloyne. She will be covering vicarious trauma and self-care to avoid burnout. Join us again at 9 a.m. for that tomorrow. Thank you again, you guys. Thanks so much for your participation.
And Eliza, they waved and they were actually really happy. They have a very visible one, and I know it's hard for them, and it's also hard for the people where you can't see it because they're like, well, you don't look XYZ. It's like, yeah, I know, but I still struggle, so could you stop?
Exactly.
Yes.
My
My number and my email now.
Yes.
So shoot me a text, email me.
Absolutely.
We'll chat. Yeah, I look forward to it.
Do I have the phone number?
Thank you.
Thank you guys.
Thank you so much. Have a great night.
You too.
Thank you.
I was
Okay.
not